Hey everyone, in this video I'm building an L-shaped horizontal case. The idea is you can put this on the corner of your desk and then put a monitor on top of it. I wanted to try out very cheap materials, so I decided to use MDF since it is stronger and cheaper than plywood, and cheap acrylic hobby paints instead of spray paint. I had to build the case twice. The first one was too small and I messed up the finish, but I'm not going to show it to you twice. That would be boring, but some parts of the video are from the initial build, so the parts won't exactly match what you see in the end result. When you have multiple pieces that share the same dimension, like the height of the case, it makes life easier if you cut them all at once without moving the saw fence. So even if you are out a little bit, the pieces are the same height. One of the reasons I wanted to try MDF apart from it being cheaper is you can put round overs on it, which doesn't work very well with plywood. And compared to a hardwood, you don't need a jointer and a thicknesser. Plus you can buy thin sheets. I used 6mm thick MDF and one 90 by 60 cm sheet was enough for this case. I added some small rounded edges around the fan holes and that worked fine. The downside to MDF is it absorbs moisture and you have to give it multiple layers of primer and paint. You also need a mask for the dust since MDF contains formaldehyde and it creates very fine dust. I made the ends of the case from hardwood scraps because I wanted to add large rounded edges on the ends and I wasn't sure how well that would work on MDF. The round over on the ends are quite big and can't be done in one pass. I had to do multiple shallow passes so it wouldn't rip out too much wood, especially at the ends. There are a few 3D printed parts for the case, like this hole for the HDMI cable and also a small handle you can use to pull the lid off. The rest are fan mesh holders and a PSU mount. I didn't add any brackets, I just glued the parts together and it seems pretty strong. From what I googled, wood glue should only start to soften up above 80 degrees Celsius, so it shouldn't be a problem in a computer case. In the first iteration the lid was an extremely tight fit, so the second time I added 2 playing cards on each side while gluing it to leave a small gap. I glued the front I/O panel in place using quick-set epoxy glue. The front surface wasn't quite flush, so I patched it up with general purpose filler and sanded it down. I used a primer and paint combination, and 2 layers was enough to cover it completely, even the edges and rounded over parts of the fan holes. Remember to give it a light sanding between layers. There was a small problem with the large round overs at the ends of the case. After painting it, the surface looked slightly different to the rest of the parts. I should have sealed the end grain parts better, or even covered them with filler and then sand them with very fine sandpaper. To paint the circles around the fan holes, I 3D printed a ring to use as a stencil, but it didn't work very well. The paint still ran a little bit under the stencil, and since it took multiple layers of paint, I struggled to hold the stencil in the exact same spot. Next time I will try to cut circles from vinyl to make proper stencils. I ran out of the maroon spray primer paint combo, so I used the opportunity to experiment with a very cheap paint method. I gave the top 2 layers of the cheapest grey primer I could find and 2 layers acrylic black hobby paint, which is also very cheap. The hobby paint is not very durable, so I had to apply thick layers with a foam brush. This is the second coat. The camera wasn't running when I painted the first one. I used acrylic wood floor polish for the top coat. It worked really well. I was able to spray it with an airbrush directly from the bottle, and it worked out a lot cheaper than top coats marketed for airbrushes. I had the pressure on the air compressor way too high, that's why it made a mist instead of the right size droplets of varnish. Another thing I learned is that if you spray on a surface that is not flat, and you maybe spray a bit too much like I did, the paint will start to run in one direction and create pools. Before I go further, I wanted to quickly talk about a few things I learned while making the first or failed iteration of this case. I 3D printed the ends of the case, but the round overs had significant layer lines. I used general purpose filler to cover the lines, but it turns out you have to use very fine sandpaper, like 400 grit. I was using 120 grit, and that actually removed the filler between the layer lines. I think 2-part body putty used for automotive work should also work better for this. I wanted to try cheap acrylic hobby paint, but they didn't have the right brown, so I mixed red, green and some orange. It actually worked pretty well as long as you apply very thick layers with a foam brush. Using a paintbrush left brush marks because the hobby paint leaves a very thin layer once dry. I messed it up by using acrylic varnish from the same hobby paint brand. It was very thick, but unlike the paint, it didn't leave a thin layer once dry. It actually left a very thick uneven layer with brush marks, even though I used a foam brush. I think it should have been thinned significantly. So always try a new paint or finish on a small part of the project or a test piece before applying it everywhere. When spray painting, the worst thing you can do is try to wipe off any screw-ups you make. It just makes it 100 times worse. The paint will soften up the layer underneath it slightly, so when you wipe it, you mess up multiple layers. Rather use a very soft brush and gently feather the paint so it will blend with the surrounding paint. I also made the first iteration too small because I didn't take into account the cabling around the GPU. I screwed the motherboard standoff straight into the MDF. But if you're going to use the case long term, rather use threaded inserts or add some CA glue to secure them in place. The only problem I ran into was finding screws that are short enough to not protrude through the MDF since it is only 6mm. I get the idea that screws push some layers of the MDF out even when they are not at the surface. Here's the hole for the HDMI cable and a place you can use to pull the cover off since it is a tight friction fit. In the second iteration, I left ample space for the GPU and cables, maybe even a bit too much. I added some brackets to support the lid when it is in place and also to hold the weight of the monitor. Because the fan mesh is stored in a roll, it tends to curl up, so I glued the fan mesh cover with UV activated epoxy so I could hold it in place while the glue set quickly. All in all, the case came out really nice. Especially the black top, which was not part of the initial plan. MDF actually worked pretty well. It makes it easier and faster to build the case, but painting multiple layers takes time. The cheap primer, acrylic hobby paint and acrylic floor polish I used for the top also worked very well, and it worked out pretty cheap. If you liked the video, please subscribe and also drop me a comment if there's something you specifically want to see me build.